Nintendo became far too comfortable during the 4th generation console race, as their strongest competition was the Sega Genesis. By the end of this generation, many other manufacturers just dropped out entirely. They still managed to be wildly successful, even if they were always entering the following generation later than expected. Nintendo introduced their NES late during the 3rd generation in 1985, and the SNES also somewhat late into the 4th generation in 1991. They still absolutely dominated in sales over everyone else, but this time, entering later ended up hurting them a lot more when seemingly their timing had no effect on the past. Sega released their Saturn system in 1995, and it had to compete fiercely with the PlayStation, which did sell significantly better than what Nintendo and Sega brought to the table. When Nintendo had been late before, they at least came in extremely strong when they did. But that was easier to justify because they only had to work extra hard to overcome Sega. This time, however, I fear that Nintendo simply entered too late, and even worse, came unprepared for what was to come. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't a valiant effort. Enter 1996, and finally, the Nintendo 64, a dearly beloved console that deserved better. Allow me to clarify right off the bat that the Nintendo 64 did do well at launch. This was a long-awaited console from Nintendo after all, and everyone's expectations were very high, so there was a lot of excitement around this console when it was announced and finally released. Not only were people this excited to see the Nintendo 64, this one launched at $199, which was an entire $100 cheaper, as the PlayStation launched at $299, and the Sega Saturn launched at $399. Sega actually had to drop their price down to $299 to match the PlayStation, but Nintendo undercut everyone massively. And for all of this, we get a lot of things that become part of the Nintendo charm. The Nintendo 64 was actually similar in size to its older brother than the SNES, while sporting much more powerful hardware. On the front, this console features 4 controller ports instead of the 2 from before. On the back, you will find an AV port for the included composite cable, and there is a spot for the power supply that powers this unit. On the top, there is a power switch and reset button, as we are used to seeing. There's also a vent in the center, and even a memory expansion slot. Finally, we have the cartridge slot, as it is very pronounced. Then at the bottom, we have some feet for this console to sit on and an extension port. Nintendo has continued persisting with including this port. But from those physical attributes that we mentioned, there are 3 main points to focus on: a cartridge slot, the memory expansion slot, and the extension port. The latter 2 will be talked about soon. So let's begin with the cartridge slot. As this is a new generation of gaming, Nintendo is now using a new cartridge system, which means that you cannot play your NES or SNES games officially on this console. Therefore, these cartridges are also largely improved. These can now hold between 4 MB and 12 MB of storage, but eventually we got 64 MB cartridges, which was a massive improvement from the 6 MB that the SNES cartridges were limited to, and this became absolutely necessary, because now 3D is the main focus for this generation, not the Mode 7 rendering that we saw before with the SNES. This was the biggest generational jump from the previous one to the current, not only in 1995, but arguably still to this day. And in order to play these games, Nintendo designed a brand new controller. We went from a reasonable controller to one that was small, yet still a substantial upgrade to one that just defies all reason. This is Nintendo's Trident controller, as I call it, that ships with the Nintendo 64, and it offers 3 grips because it allows for 2 grip styles. Nintendo intends for you to hold this controller like this, for the most part, as most games will need to be played this way with access to the secondary C functions, which is a brand new concept. AB buttons instead of the ABXY from before, the start button and analog stick, not to mention the R shoulder button and the Z button on the back of the middle grip. The other was for when you wanted to access the D-pad, which I suppose was meant for playing 2D games such as Mortal Kombat, and allows full access to the L and R shoulder buttons while neglecting the Z button. The quality of the buttons is mostly fine. The seldom used C buttons are actually quite nice and have a nice amount of travel and resistance. The AB buttons are not as solid, but they are wider and easier to press, as well as still feeling pretty okay. The D-pad is actually pretty good, and it feels like a more solid version of the one that we had had with the SNES. Now, the analog stick is a component that is completely required for the majority of games on this console, but this one is quite prone to failure. But worse, this thumbstick is the worst one I have ever used on any controller. This is not a smooth stick that moves freely when maneuvering, but instead, it's one that feels like a rusted gear as you feel every movement and how it struggles to move within its contraption. Additionally, this analog stick is quite flimsy, and its quality is reflected in how few of them are actually left out in the wild with a good thumbstick. Many people do blame this issue on Mario Party, but I just think that this thumbstick was poorly designed from the start. But the last thing to note about this controller is this slot on the back. This is for 3 accessories. You can use a controller pack which was made to save game data from games that were compatible with it, specifically for transferring your save data to this controller pack and loading it onto a different Nintendo 64, because save data from the cartridge couldn't be transferred. Then we had the transfer pack, which was specifically to use some of the Pokemon that you have on your copy of Pokemon Yellow, Red, and Blue in Pokemon Stadium. Then we have the Rumble pack, which was to get full Rumble functionality on your controller when playing games. This pack requires 2 AA batteries, but it does work, and quite aggressively so. The Nintendo 64 seemed to want to do it all, and to have all of these features to separate itself from the competition, for better or for worse. So while the hardware itself is very important to touch on when discussing the Nintendo 64, what defines whether or not any game console is any good is whether or not it has great games. The Nintendo 64 holds some of the most nostalgic games from this generation, and some that absolutely helped to define what it meant to have a great 3D game. The Nintendo 64 got its name because it went from playing 16-bit games on the SNES to 64-bit on this console. On top of that, the Nintendo 64 was the most powerful console from this generation, which should have opened the floor up to developers to create more ambitious titles. But Nintendo's hardware architecture prevented developers from continuing to work with them this time around. The Nintendo 64 is infamous for being very difficult to develop for, and so this was because of 2 major problems: the texture cache and the kind of RAM that this console uses. The texture cache was an issue because of how small it was, being only 4 kilobytes, which meant that developers had to use very low resolution textures, which contributed greatly to games looking as if they ran at a lower resolution than they actually did. And even though accessing additional memory needed from the cartridge was an option in order to load higher resolution textures from it, usually resulted in needing cartridges that were larger in storage, which meant that there were higher costs associated with developers who just get these games out as intended. But the RAM itself also became an issue because the RDRAM that they used allowed for fantastic bandwidth for data transfers, but it had a lot of latency associated with it, which essentially means that they couldn't rely on it too much to allow their games to run as intended. Some developers even resorted to allocating these textures that wouldn't be feasible to use with the Nintendo 64's memory onto the cartridge itself. Developers simply had to find too many workarounds to push their games out on Nintendo's platform. But there's a third problem, and this is the biggest issue with Nintendo's hardware. It's the fact that they stuck with cartridges once more. Nintendo's cartridges could hold up to 64 megabytes as of much later into this generation, but of course, they could only hold between 4 and 12 megabytes of storage at first, as noted earlier. But Sony's implementation of CDs allowed for each individual disc to hold up to 700 megabytes of storage. This was a game changer, and all of these aspects limited developers greatly in what games they were able to make, and many realized this very quickly. As a result, Nintendo lost a lot of third-party support. Companies like Squaresoft, Enix, Konami, among others found a better home with Sony at the end of it all. But that's not to say by any stretch of the imagination that the games that Nintendo managed to put out were bad. They were actually very, very good and are still held to high regard to this day. Games like Super Mario 64 were huge because we were so used to seeing Mario in 2D for so long, and seeing him in 3D navigating environments freely was such a special experience. This was a 3D platformer that has inspired many speedruns, as there are so many unique ways of beating different levels to either save time or extend it in any given playthrough. Ocarina of Time is also a very new twist on the Zelda formula, as you can also move freely in a 3D space, and this playstyle allows for so many more possibilities than other games like Mario Kart 64, Star Fox 64, and Donkey Kong 64 were fantastic additions that brought these franchises to new life on the Nintendo 64. GoldenEye 007 was quite popular, as well as it introduced first-person shooters shooting mechanics to the Nintendo 64, and Perfect Dark was another gem of this genre. But this is also the introduction of the very first Super Smash Bros. Game, which allows you to play as different characters from the Nintendo universe for a big brawl. And as mentioned before, Mario Party 2 was incredibly popular, and it made use of the 4-controller support available only on Nintendo's console. This is also the generation where Nintendo brought over Pokemon to their home consoles, which came in the form of Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2, which were huge on this platform and allowed us to see our favorite Pokemon up to this point in 3D on an actual arena. Pokemon Snap was cool too. And even if Nintendo lost a lot of third-party support, they still had some support from great developers that dropped games like Doom 64, Resident Evil 2, and Rayman 2, which were quite popular. These were just some of the best games on this platform, so there are still quite a few left to explore. But remember, those limitations that I mentioned earlier, largely regarding texture cache and the lack of a method to reliably access the internal memory of this console, well, Nintendo introduced their memory expansion packs to serve that purpose, which is to be placed in the memory expansion slot. You see, the Nintendo 64 came with a jumper pack included, which is slotted into the slot. This is because Nintendo needed a way to neutralize the Rambus bus, as it wasn't needed if you didn't add any additional memory. The memory expansion slot is there for the games that require more RAM to allow for greater usability, or that just will not play without it. You see, the Nintendo 64 shipped with 4 MB of RAM, which was enough to play most games as intended. However, many games had features that were not enabled unless you added the expansion pack, doubling the RAM to 8 MB. This was done because Nintendo anticipated that they would likely be pushing out more graphically impressive games later, but the N64 had those memory limitations out of the box. But even more likely, it was to allow developers more headroom for what amounts of memory they can access for their games. Some games received more access to higher resolution, such as Pokemon Stadium 2, but this is not required for this game to be playable at all. Other games added nicer textures to their environments, or even added more on-screen models such as Majora's Mask, but this game was still playable without it. But a game like Donkey Kong 64 required this expansion pack, otherwise it wouldn't boot at all. If you did get this expansion pack, then you'd likely find that it was worth it, as it gave quite a few of your games a visual upgrade that is not available with only 4 MB of RAM, and even gives you access to the entire N64 library. Following this up, Nintendo tried to expand on the Nintendo 64's potential through the EXT port, or extension port as I call it, but the only accessory they released was the 64DD, which was only sold in Japan. The whole purpose of this accessory was to play games off of a floppy disk that could hold more data, which was important back when the N64 cartridges could only hold up to 12 MB. However, this prospect became obsolete as Nintendo eventually offered 64 MB cartridges. On top of that, there seemed to be a lot of uncertainty around this project, as the N64 wasn't selling nearly as well as the PlayStation, and Nintendo even thought of including data vending machines where you could insert a blank disc and the data for a game becomes burned onto it. But this is only sold through a mail subscription service, and very few of these ended up making it out into the market. So this was a failure, and the extension port was never used again. Games intended to go onto the 64DD just made it into regular N64 cartridges. Now that we know what the hardware was like and what games were released around this time to really push the N64 forward, even discussing the development issues and the many things that went wrong with the system, we need to talk about how Sega and Sony were keeping up and how the N64 ultimately ended up in the middle when it came to sales. Competition was very intense, and Nintendo had to work hard to keep up. There were actually quite a few consoles that were released as part of the 5th generation. This includes the 3DO, the Atari Jaguar, the PlayStation, the Sega Saturn, the N64, and even the Apple Pippin. But in terms of raw numbers, Nintendo only had to compete with Sega Saturn and Sony's PlayStation. But this is still a tall order, and part of what made it so difficult is that many third-party developers stopped supporting Nintendo to release their games on the PlayStation. This is how we ended up getting games like Final Fantasy VII, 8, and 9, Vagrant Story, Silent Hill, Gran Turismo, The Legend of Dragoon, Chrono Cross, Metal Gear Solid, and so many more that could basically only fit on CDs. And because of this third-party support being so overwhelming, the PlayStation became a console for just about everybody, while the Nintendo 64 was still a console that is marketed to more children and does lack that edge that Sony and Sega had. Sega had games like Nights into Dreams, Sonic R, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Guardian Heroes, Radiant Silvergun, X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Sonic Jam, and many more, which also offered a wide range of games for different people. Nintendo did have many amazing games. A lot of these games were just hit after hit, essentially, as there are very few bad Nintendo 64 games, but Nintendo became a victim of circumstance. Sega was still lagging behind Nintendo, but then Nintendo was really lagging behind Sony, and they are brand new into this video game space. But having the advantage of releasing their consoles sooner, embracing CDs to allow developers to go a little more wild without cutting into their bottom lines, and to making their lives exponentially easier by giving them a platform that is easy to program for, as well as even having a more comfortable gaming experience through the controller, gave them a much bigger edge. And it really does seem like consumers just had it too good with the PlayStation, so Nintendo did struggle to push onward. Even if they really were up to something here, they really did try, but it seems that so much got in the way this generation. Ultimately, Nintendo went second place this generation, but they were a very distant second place, as they only sold 32 million units, compared to the 49 million from the SNES before this. Regardless of what came about in the mid to late 90s, the Nintendo 64 is remembered very fondly because it was a very interesting system that certainly had lots of fantastic games. It just could have been the console that had even more fantastic games, rather than the small library that it ended up with by the end of it all, compared to its competition. To this day, I'd say that this is still a console that is a lot of fun to collect for, and since I now use a wireless controller from Retro Fighters, I can play all of my games much more comfortably than intended. I love my Nintendo 64, even if I only had a handful of games from this console that I care to play. But Nintendo had the opportunity to reflect on this, technically speaking, failure, and as a result, they came up with a system that had the potential to be much more competitive, and so there's a lot that needs to be said about this one. So stick around while I explore some other devices in the meantime, in preparation for the video on its successor. Thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries, and until next time.